Hello and welcome to the latest Royal Institute of Philosophy lecture from the London lecture series on the theme of expanding horizons. We've reached a kind of a halfway point in our series. We're going to take a break after this and come back in February. We've had a very interesting and diverse range of talks, very fitting for our theme. The idea of expanding horizons, just that we are very aware that philosophy, which for a lot of the 20th century was criticised, sometimes unfairly, sometimes fairly, for being narrow in its scope, at least in the English-speaking world, had in recent years really begun to sort of become much more open to different cultures, different questions, different methods and other disciplines. And this series is a way of both celebrating and encouraging that trend. This evening's talk, I'm very happy to welcome Eileen John. Eileen John is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Warwick, and she directs Warwick's Centre for Research in Philosophy, Literature and the Arts. She says of her work that her research concerns how art and creative practices engage us as cognitive and ethical works in progress. She has a specific interest in literature and its philosophical and ethical roles, and she tries to show the relevance of literary works to contemporary debates concerning, for example, personhood, ethical disagreement, and value formation. We're going to hear Eileen's talk, and then after that we're going to open up to discussion. And we'd very much like you to be part of that discussion, and a way to do that is to enter your question into the chat function, whether you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook. A couple of little pointers for those questions. Try to make them as clear as possible so that we can understand them. We don't have to second guess what you mean. And also do try and get the whole question into one box so it doesn't roll over two or three different boxes. I'll remind you of that later, but let's just get on and hear the talk. And Eileen's title this evening is Can Aesthetics Be Global?
Well, thank you, Julian, for inviting me to do this lecture. I've taken the theme of expanding horizons as a chance to think about some issues I rarely face squarely in my own work, and that concerns aesthetics, philosophy, and our lives as aesthetic beings. Let me say a couple of things about the images I'm starting with. The two larger images are tea bowls. The one on the left, I hope it's on your left, is a Korean 16th or 17th century tea bowl, and you can see the repairs to it, made with gold, made in Japan, they think. The other, more central tea bowl is Japanese, but apparently made to imitate the Korean style, also repaired with gold. So we'll come back to these kind of examples later on. Then, because I was showing you those two wonderful old objects, I thought I'd show you a couple of images from my own life, two cups that I use on a pretty regular basis. One, the one with a thistle flower on it, that was made in a pottery in New Jersey, about 10 miles or so from where I was born. And the other one I bought in Coventry at the Music Museum. I don't know if you can see, it says Two-Tone Records on it. And I guess I'll offer those to you as a little hint of the possibly chaotic aesthetic life of a 21st century person like me. Okay, but anyway, these are all human artifacts that in some way people have used in their lives, and I'm interested in how they look and how we respond to them. Okay, so I'm going to think about whether the following three things can be triangulated. First, the individuality and cultural locatedness of each of our aesthetic lives. Second, the aim of aesthetics, that is a branch of philosophy, to account for aesthetic life in philosophical terms. And third, the aim of philosophy to formulate concepts and principles with universal relevance. I'm going to do a whirlwind tour through this triangular relationship, hoping to offer a no and yes answer that will make some sense by the time we get to the end. I'm going to start at the bottom with 3, the aim of philosophy, and I'm going to consider a challenge that was posed to much academic philosophy a few years ago. This is from an opinion piece in the New York Times. So I'm quoting from this opinion piece. Of the top 50 philosophy doctoral programs in the English-speaking world, only 15% have any regular faculty members who teach any non-Western philosophy. Quote, no other humanities discipline demonstrates this systematic neglect of most of the civilizations in its domain. So the writers recommend that departments should be renamed Department of European and American Philosophy. This simple change would make the domain and mission of these departments clear. They say non-European philosophical traditions offer distinctive solutions to problems discussed within European and American philosophy, raise or frame problems not addressed in that tradition, or emphasize and discuss more deeply philosophical problems that are marginalized in that tradition. We hope that philosophy departments will someday teach Confucius as routinely as they now teach Kant, that philosophy students will eventually have as many opportunities to study the Bhagavad Gita as they do the Republic. Okay, and the authors of that are Brian Van Norden and Jay Garfield. Now, that piece was written in 2016, and my guess is some of the facts they're pointing to have changed even since then. And one thing I'd say about this, part of the problem that they're pointing to is that the domain and mission, as they call it, of philosophy departments seem arguably to be both exactly what they say, historically region and culture specific, but not so limited in their self-conception and their intellectual and human ambitions. That is, I don't think philosophy departments think they're just addressing a limited cultural context. So let me say a little bit more about that. Suppose that, as seems possible, each philosophical tradition, and I mean Chinese philosophical traditions, European ones, everywhere, suppose that each of them aims for universality. Is this part of what it means to be philosophical? To think about the most basic nature of reality, how to be oriented within reality, say how to know things, how to desire things, how to locate one's ego, and how to live well, to think about what has value. So roughly, to think about questions that can arise for anyone, whenever, wherever, whoever you are. So not the nature of 2021 reality, not how to be oriented to reality in, for instance, Coventry, Jakarta, Bogota, or Dakar. Not how to live well just for you or for me. Okay, if you were focused in those ways, you possibly wouldn't be doing philosophy. Now, Van Norden and Garfield do not resolve the question of whether the goal is what you might call a global philosophy that would kind of harmonize everything, or whether the goal is to preserve distinct philosophical traditions in diverse, regionally, culturally, linguistically affiliated homes. The quote from them that I gave where they're talking about problems suggests that maybe there is a shared pool of problems and we need to all help each other out with them. That points perhaps toward the global philosophy model, but I don't think they're not settling this. So, as academic philosophy awakens to its limitations and embraces a complex, diverse world of philosophical thought, as it is gradually doing, and I think must do, what happens to universality as a goal? How should philosophical ambitions evolve? Okay. I'm going to move on to the second thing on my list, which is the aim of aesthetics. Aesthetics, as a branch of philosophy, studies qualities of experience, responsiveness to those qualities, and the making, experience, interpretation, and appreciation of art. There's sort of two things that come together in philosophical aesthetics, and there's a lot of debate about how and why they come together. Is it really just about experience and special possibilities of experience, or is it really about art? It's usually those two things are connected. I'm not going to resolve that issue about the nature of aesthetics. Western philosophical aesthetics has emphasized the appreciative relation between stimulus and perceiver. For instance, what is it to experience beauty or sublimity in the world? And also, can claims about aesthetic value have intersubjective warrant? Aesthetic value is a sort of more contemporary term that's supposed to be broader than terms like beauty or sublimity. Those are sort of have too much baggage, and people have wanted a kind of vaguer term, so they've used this notion of aesthetic value. And then they've asked, can these claims stand up intersubjectively? Is aesthetics just a subjective domain? But that's the kind of thing Western aesthetics has really focused on. I'm going to give you a little taste of Immanuel Kant, who I think is the most influential aesthetic theorist in the Western tradition, writing around the end of the 18th century. So he says about the judgment of beauty that it's a matter of taking disinterested pleasure. That's a technical term for him. A disinterested pleasure in the free play of one's cognitive powers within your first-person experience of an object. Don't worry if not all of this makes full sense. I just want to give you a sense of the kind of approach he takes and highlight a few of his other claims. He says, no one allows himself to be talked into his judgment about the beauty of a garment, house, or flower by means of any grounds or fundamental principles. One wants to submit the object to his own eyes. Okay, that's from this critique of the aesthetic power of judgment, where he lays out his theory. He says, we ground our judgment of beauty on a feeling, not as a private feeling, but as a common one. Okay, people usually find that kind of puzzling and interesting. He says, beauty is valid only for human beings, that is, animal, but also rational beings. So I put that last claim in there in purple because that was a claim I read when I was an undergraduate, and it really grabbed me. I thought, Kant is saying beauty is a human thing. It's one of the things that makes us special. And it involves us being animals, but also thinkers. And I liked the boldness of that claim. And I think you can look at what Kant is doing in this way, that it's kind of vision of aesthetic response as a universally shared human faculty, not demanding knowledge or cultivated taste, but activating basic human experiential and cognitive capacities. This is not the only way people think about Kant, but it's a way that I want to emphasize, right? He says this, when you're judging something to be beautiful, one solicits assent from everyone else because one has a ground for it that is common to all. So for Kant, the experience of beauty is something we all have access to in common. It's based on something we share with everyone else. Okay, so I like this as a kind of approach to the universality of aesthetics, universality of aesthetic life. All right. But let's go back to one, which is the aesthetic dimension of life as we live it. All right? I'll just say some general things about what I mean. I think we are constantly orienting ourselves to reality aesthetically. We are experiencing and simultaneously responding to our environments through more than conceptual classification. We're feeling what is familiar, coherent, out of sync, interesting, boring, mood-enhancing or mood-deadening, glorious, awful, to be shunned or savored. Like we're sort of doing this pervasively through the day. And that is, I think, a pretty basic, important kind of orientation to reality. And I'd say it's basic to feeling at home in the world or not feeling at home in the world. When you don't feel at home in the world, I think part of that is likely to be aesthetic disorientation. Okay. Now, the aesthetic responsiveness is not isolated. It binds with and quickly feeds into more cognitively and practically focused interpretations of reality. This basic aesthetic experience turns into categorizing. It helps us compare things, choose things, decide what to preserve, what to destroy, helps us assess danger and all sorts of environmental conditions and possibilities that are relevant to action. And I guess I just think it happens in each of us personally, individually, this orientation, and it will reflect our specific life paths. But, to complicate things, it also embeds assumptions, expectations, needs, and desires that we acquire as members of specific groups and cultures. So I think there are two interconnecting forms of non-universality at work in us as we develop an aesthetic orientation to life. I'm going to illustrate this personal aspect of aesthetic life with two passages from Toni Morrison's short novel, The Bluest Eye. This novel has been kind of important to me in my own philosophical history, and I'm just picking out a couple of passages to show a little bit what I'm thinking about. This passage concerns a young girl going to the corner shop to buy some candy. Okay, so here's Morrison on this girl's walk to the shop. 3 pennies are in her shoe, slipping back and forth between the sock and the inner sole. With each step, she feels the painful press of the coins against her foot, a sweet, endurable, even cherished irritation, full of promise and delicate security. She moves down an avenue gently buffeted by the familiar and therefore loved images. The dandelions at the base of the telephone pole. There was the sidewalk crack shaped like a Y, and the other one that lifted the concrete up from the dirt floor. They were real to her. She knew them. They were the codes and touchstones of the world, capable of translation and possession. She owned the crack that made her stumble. She owned the clumps of dandelions whose white heads last fall she had blown away. And owning them made her part of the world and the world a part of her. Okay, I hope you can see part of what I'm after here, this being at home in the world. This is a passage in which Morrison, I think, is trying to evoke that by portraying this girl's close recognition of these sort of trivial things in her world, the dandelions, the cracked pavement, and so on. Morrison does a lot more with this passage. It sets up an arc in which the girl goes to the store. She's black. The shopkeeper is white. He treats her with contempt or distaste. And when she comes out of the shop, she no longer can have this experience of the dandelions, for instance. She calls them weeds. And so Morrison is talking about the social pressures on our ability to have an aesthetic life that's our own. But this passage is the happy part of it, where I think she's just getting at, what it's like to be a child and be fully aesthetically attuned to where you live. Second passage is from the narrator of this novel, talking about the fact that she gets these white baby dolls for Christmas, and that's not what she wants. Okay, so this is Claudia, the narrator, also an African-American girl. But I did know that nobody ever asked me what I wanted for Christmas. They would have known that I did not want to have anything to own or to possess any object. I wanted rather to feel something on Christmas Day. I want to sit on the low stool in Big Mama's kitchen with my lap full of lilacs and listen to Big Papa play his violin for me alone. The lowness of the stool made for my body, the security and warmth of Big Mama's kitchen, the smell of the lilacs, the sound of the music, and since it would be good to have all of my senses engaged, the taste of a peach, perhaps, afterward. Interesting things to say about the role of ownership and possession in these two passages. Leave that aside. That's from Morrison. I take these passages to articulate the highly personal aspect of aesthetic orientation. So I'd kind of ask each of us, which patches of the earth are familiar and loved by me or you? How would each of us specify a fully enveloping desired experience, as Claudia does in the passage right here? Okay, now I'm going to switch gears and think about the other piece of the non-universality. So let's think about diverse, historically and culturally located aesthetic orientations. How our aesthetic lives embody collective practices, evolving traditions and sources of meaning. I'm going to look at two examples from aesthetics in discussions that explicitly aim to give access to aesthetic traditions, Chinese painting, and a kind of Japanese taste to people who are not at home in them, like me. And these are both discussions I studied in my aesthetic education, so I'm turning back to them because I found them illuminating when I encountered them. First, here's British philosopher Harold Osborne on traditional Chinese painting. And a quote from him to give you a sense of the sorts of features he thinks need to be communicated to someone who doesn't understand this tradition. Quote, the Chinese painter was not concerned, except incidentally to the pursuit of other aims, to imitate the appearances of things, or to represent things ideally as he would like them to be. The cultivation and practice of painting were thought of as a ritualistic activity, creating an embodiment of the cosmic force of order, which infuses all reality, human society, and the individual personality. His work would be imbued with and would reflect the Tao. And this reference to imitation of appearances will call to mind for Western-trained philosopher Plato's rather dismissive account of painters as imitators. The aesthetic principles of calligraphic brushwork constituted the core of appreciation in painting. Monochrome painting, whose excellences lay in the subtle variation and blending of tones and the appropriate style of brushstroke, was perfected. The styles of brushstroke were elaborately classified. They were like tangled hemp or the veins of the lotus leaf, and there are a whole bunch of categories like this. The paradigm of the Chinese painting was the scroll, which was opened gradually and read consecutively in time by the observer, not seen in a piece. So all of these things, not imitative, imbued with the Tao, calligraphy being, as it were, the entry into appreciation of painting, these very finely delineated kinds of brush stroke. And then this notion of paintings as scrolls that could be read. I find all of this really interesting and something I'm not attuned to immediately. So that's from 1970. Second example is Yuriko Saito on what she calls, this is the name of her article, The Japanese Aesthetics of Imperfection and Insufficiency. She says this is a quintessentially, or considered a quintessentially Japanese taste, the celebration of those qualities commonly regarded as falling short of or deteriorating from the optimal condition of the object. So, for instance, impoverished-looking and irregularly shaped Korean peasants' bowls, often with chips and cracks, were highly esteemed. So those were those images from the beginning where they're cups that are, as it were, on their way out of usefulness that have been preserved and repaired with gold. So there's something quite interesting going on there. She traces really complex sources and kinds of meaning for this aesthetics of imperfection and insufficiency. I'm just going to give a sample of the things she talks about. There's aesthetic potential to this, of contrasts, of the evocation of the ending of things, of wondering about an object's history when you can see the evidence that it's had a hard life. And she talks about the appreciation of imperfection being entwined with a yearning for perfection. She talks about the socio-political meaning of this kind of taste. Was it a privileged pleasure that you could have because you could get the perfect object if you wanted? It was encouraged politically because it was thought to help the wealthy and powerful refrain from being ostentatious. It was thought to have value in encouraging the non-privileged to be satisfied with insufficiency. And then this taste was critiqued for putting a positive aesthetic spin on real poverty. But then she also traces it to religious and metaphysical potential meanings. Shintoism's egalitarian affirmation of things with, no value discriminations being made. Or Zen Buddhist ideals of overcoming the ego, of surrendering to materials, of accepting lack of control. Saito and Osborne both are signaling the great scope, the depth, and the intersection of factors that can lie behind being at home with an aesthetic taste or an artistic practice. Do these examples of intricately meaningful traditions argue for the intractability of universalizing aesthetic theorization, somewhat differently from the personal aesthetics, but I think it just adds to the difficulty. I'm going to conclude here by trying to reckon philosophically with these phenomena, with the personal and the cultural locatedness of aesthetic life. And this is just an initiation of thinking for me. This is not a resolved line of thought. It's a sketch of responses. So, 1. I guess I think we should not seek a global aesthetics if what that means is seeking a harmonized conception of aesthetic engagement and a set of evaluative concepts that apply universally. That just doesn't seem interesting to me even, much less possible. I think we should study the interesting, diverse substance of aesthetic life. We should encounter more than one feels at home with. Do not assume convergence and interpersonal agreement, but try to compare, to translate, to enable access to aesthetic variation with care, caution, humility. So what Saito and Osborne were doing, I find really helpful. There's a lot of scholarship lying behind what they did, as well as personal experience. And I think that's the kind of challenging work that people like me should do more of. I think we need to defer or demote concern for judgment of aesthetic and artistic value. Assessing what is best or most valuable seems unhelpful, if not thoroughly intractable in this context. I think understanding forms of aesthetic life comes first. Fourth, what am I doing when I do aesthetics in this mode? I think you could think of it as exploring a space of possibilities. What factors can combine in aesthetic life? And given those possibilities, can any general patterns, tendencies, common values in aesthetic life be discerned? So you have to have a quite open-ended goal. You can't be assuming that it's going to converge, that you will get the general patterns, but you have to see what seems possible. And I think you have to attempt to identify and test your own universalizing commitments. So to do this talk, I had to think, what do I universalize about? I'm EJ. Well, I assume aesthetic orientation is central to being at home in the world. And I don't mean that in a local, personal way. I mean that universally. Can I defend that? Another point, well, sort of building off my Kantian education, I take humankind to be the aesthetically relevant kind. Those are the beings whose aesthetic lives I'm interested in. Is that okay? Is that defensible? Third, I assume that the personal aesthetic path has weight, that it is not simply a product of collective pressures and socialization. Can I really support that? Is that universal in the right way? And lastly, I think it's worth acknowledging, or important to acknowledge and reflect critically on the global movements of aesthetic traditions. They collide, meld, they're imposed on each other, there's suppression, elevation, appropriation, primitivization, commercialization, there's loss, there's renewal. And all of those, I think, are philosophically potentially very interesting and important to formulate and evaluate those processes properly. Okay, so I'll leave you with those responses, and I'm glad to talk about any of this and hope to get some questions from you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eileen. Lots to think about there. Left us with 6 very interesting questions. If you do want to ask a question, you're watching live, please do enter them into the chat box, and please do try and make them clear and concise and to fit within one entry, and we'll come to them in time. But I've got plenty of questions of my own. And I want to actually, well, I say rather than questions, I think there are things to discuss and explore a bit more, because you've introduced so many themes here. And in particular, I perhaps want to explore a little bit more this tension between, the universalizing aspiration of philosophy and its evident parochiality, but also more general themes, I think, about how we approach the universal when we are very much rooted in the particular. First of all, one sort of thought I had there was that, you're very interested in literature and fiction. And one thing that's said about that is that precisely what that's doing there is it's often dealing with universal themes through a very particular story. So you're reading a story about one person in one place in one time. But, it resonates with people beyond that because, well, if it's done well, that's one of the things it does. So I suppose a question I've got really here is it a false assumption to think that if something is very rooted in the particular, in the local, that it can't illuminate the universal? And does that apply to philosophy and to philosophical aesthetics?
Yeah, that's a great sort of bringing together of my themes. And Yes, so partly you're harking back to Aristotle, which is a good thing to do. I mean, that's one of the things he says long, long ago about what these characters in, say, Greek tragedy are for us. Well, they seem like named individuals. Achilles, Oedipus. But he says I wish I could quote him directly, but they are actually universals. I mean, they show up, they seem to act and speak and, affect us as individuals, and yet what we are doing with them has more to do with kinds and universal characters, and the possibilities for those characters. Okay, so if he's right about that, and I actually do think there's something quite right about that representations of human life reach out to us as representations, as someone saying, here is a category or a set of categories that are relevant to living a life. And then you get to think about those categories, as well as engaging with the story and imagining somebody doing what they're doing and killing their father and marrying their mother, etc. But it's also the kind of being that might do that, and so you get access to these universal kinds, qualities, concepts, really. So I think that's quite right. And as people, I mean, maybe I'm going to just universalize some more about people. We're really good at, as it were, creating the context that makes sense to us. So let me give you an example. There's a really interesting essay by the 20th century American writer James Baldwin. Okay, so he grew up in Harlem in the 1930s. Quite poor. He had a teacher who really cared about him and got him reading Charles Dickens, okay? And he was a very precocious reader. But so he has a kind of memoir essay where he talks about reading, what's the one about the French Revolution? My mind is, well, anyway, oh my gosh. Cannot think of it. Anyway, Madame Lafarge, and it's Tale of Two Cities. Oh, okay. Is that? Okay, so anyway, he reads this Dickens, like 19th century British novel, really seems to have nothing to do with Harlem, and he says, I saw Madame Lafarge in my neighborhood. I saw the blood running on the streets. And you think, okay, he wasn't granting that Dickens was relevant to 19th century England. He was saying, he was reading it for him and making it matter in his world. Okay, so suppose that's part of what we do with art, and I hope it is. There's a way in which we are able to sort of build new aesthetic connections, sort of creatively. And now, I guess the issue is what have we done there? Have we proven that there is a universal connection here, that what was meaningful to Dickens or his audience is in the same way meaningful to a child in 1930s Harlem? I don't know. I don't know how to prove that. But I guess I shouldn't, I want to allow that we are capable of kind of seeing beyond our own local personal patch. definitely, we have to do that. Art definitely helps us do that. I guess I'm just not so interested in whether we can therefore claim here are some universal truths about human nature or, the themes of the work. That is going to be hard to prove. Anyway, I guess I'm just saying, yeah, I like the challenge you're posing to me, really, that you don't want to throw out universalizing tendencies too quickly because they might, in fact, be really important to us and, in fact, quite crucial to what we're doing with art.
Yeah, I suppose the part I'm thinking of here is whether or not, when we think about what it means to be universal, whether we might be at risk of having a very particular understanding of that, which is sort of mistaken. So, excuse me for going on a bit too long, as what should be a question, but you think about Thomas Nagel and the view from nowhere. I mean, the point about one of the points of Nagel's view from nowhere is that if objectivity means be able to completely uproot yourself from your own point of view and to see things with a kind of a God's eye, it's of course impossible. But he was talking about how we have the capacity to gain a sort of a more objective way of looking at things. But there's also a sort of way of thinking about it, which is very prominent in Jain thinking, of course, which is that you gain a certain objectivity or universality by combining different perspectives. So, I mean, to put it this way, for example, I mean, everything in the world we know through the senses. We can taste them, we can see them, we can hear them, whatever it might be. And all these different modalities are very, very different, but they're all of the same thing. And they all, have their truths about them. And so I'm going a bit of a long way around here. When we're thinking about, what we're trying to do, because I'm also interested in the question you've got, the broader question about philosophy you introduced at the beginning, the J. Garfield, Brian Van Norden sort of point that there are these different philosophical traditions and the West has tended to ignore the non-Western ones. But it's an open question in the article you refer to whether the objective is to try and create the one philosophy or preserve all these different traditions. And I'm just wondering how much you're sympathetic to the view that actually it's by, as it were, preserving the different traditions that we actually can get the best view overall, because that allows us to have more perspectives than if we try and create the one global philosophy. It's an unfair question, it's too big, but if you've got any thoughts on that, it'd be interesting.
Well, let me just say that one of the first things you said, I think, is quite important. Like, we shouldn't think it's sort of all or nothing, objectivity or chaos and, arbitrary subjectivity. No, it's actually, it seems that you can improve your, you can expand your horizons, to take the theme of the lecture series, in a way that becomes more resilient to challenge and more capable of handling problems. And so even if you could never say, this is the view from nowhere, you could say, well, now we are better able to see, what's, how the issues are configured and different ways of approaching them. So you've added perspectives helpfully. Now, in terms of what happens when you bring together traditions that might even seem to just conflict, say that they give rationality a different priority or role, or let's say, well, it still seems to take your kind of what I took to be a positive, optimistic thought, is that you do learn about your own tradition by, as it were, seeing the outside of it, like seeing how it looks to another tradition. So if I'm obsessed with rationality, it could be really illuminating to try to get inside the view that thinks that doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you privilege rationality? That somehow, even if you're not quite sure how you put all this together, you have advanced in your understanding. You're seeing maybe the limitations of a certain, conceptual scheme or a set of values that you have thought were unassailable. At least you can think about why they are assailable, and that seems, you could count that as an advance in general philosophical understanding. I suppose that's why, when I try to think about how literary works help me as a philosopher, it often in a way is this sort of process where things I've taken for granted as the only way to think about something, they just start to look non-obvious when you see a literary work that doesn't assume all of that.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. We've got some questions coming, so I'll come to it in a minute. Thank you to Zach Stinchcombe, who was sort of screaming out across the ether a tale of two cities. But Eileen, I don't think you can actually read these comments in front of you, so I think maybe it worked telepathically because you did get it in the end. I'm terrible remembering names of anything. But there are a few more things I just wanted to talk about before here. I thought it was really interesting. You talked early on about, I like this phrase, the chaotic aesthetic life of a 21st century person. And I think, what that kind of points to me is this sense in which for a lot of people, not everyone by any stretch of imagination, but a typical person like you or I, we live in this kind of cosmopolitan kind of realm where we like to enjoy things from different traditions and different cultures, and perhaps people even take kind of a pride in that, sometimes to the extent they actually can even end up looking down on their own. But in the Toni Morrison passage you read, there was another phrase which struck me, which was familiar and therefore loved images, and it was a familiar and therefore loved I thought was very interesting. And it just made me wonder about this, what you're saying about feeling at home in the world and so forth. It seems to me you're saying there's something important to our aesthetic sensibility about being located. And if that's so, well, you might want to say something else about that, but if that's so, is there something lost if we sort of can one become too cosmopolitan, if you like, because one loses that sense of being at home anywhere and having that real attuned, perhaps your aesthetic sensibilities just get diluted rather than expanded.
Okay, I think that's rather a deep, question for self-reflection. I think we could each ask ourselves this. I don't want to romanticize, as it were, the simple aesthetic life where, there's just not, there's just great continuity and not much innovation or something like that. But there's something about having no patterns or nothing that you could particularly think, that's what a street scene looks like to me, or that's what a piece of furniture, that I can identify as my kind of furniture. I think there is something lost there when you just might each thing. Well, that could be part of my life. That could fit into my scheme of things. I think that's probably. I'm just sensing, or I'm just speculating, that is difficult for beings like us to sustain with contentment. One thing that perhaps is going on in the Morrison passages is that she's trying to channel the childlike. And I think as children, possibly we're a bit better at just really coming to know where we're at. I don't know if you remember, like, whatever, the cracks on the ceiling in the room I slept in as a child, they were very, very, like, I really knew them. And this thing about how it feels to put coins in your shoe when you're going to the, I actually did that as a child. I hadn't thought about it again until I read Toni Morrison, and then I thought, that was a very, you know, I really knew what it was like to have my coins in my shoe. And to have that, like to know what it's going to feel like when you go somewhere, what it's going to look like. I don't know. We don't have so much of that. And we have, I think what you were saying is we've sort of willingly, if we're privileged enough to be able to eat food from all over the world or have decoration that comes from all kinds of places, we've sort of happily piled that on. Again, if you can afford to do that. And what is the outcome? I do think I'm rather aesthetically chaotic. And I'm not, I'm not willing to think that that's just kind of a nice, happy hubbub. I think it might be actually a bit just chaotic.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, I also wonder if there's a potential sort of double standards there as well, because it strikes me again that a lot of people who pride themselves in their cosmopolitanism, they're kind of parasitic on other people not being so. You want to appreciate whatever it might be. Let's say traditional African woodwork, for example, and you're very disappointed if you find out that actually it's not made by someone who's been doing it in the family for 10 generations, but it's actually been done by someone who's moved in from China or whatever it might be. And I just wonder if there's that potential, it's like there's always this risk of this exoticization. Okay,
right.
Let's drop that thought then. Okay, I've got a question actually which relates to this about feeling at home in the world from said Zach, who remembered Tale of Two Cities, Stinchcombe, who says, I was really interested in your claim about feeling at home in the world. What do you make of Adorno's assertion that being at home in a world might mean we are maladjusted to that world? Perhaps a little bit of a sideways question, because maybe what Adorno meant wasn't quite the same as what you meant. But so maybe there isn't anything. I don't want to. We put up these questions, but feel free just to say I don't want to do that one.
Well, I won't give a good answer to this, but I do want to say hello to Zach, whom I know, and I'm happy that he's here. So, and I don't remember Adorno saying that. So I'm thinking of different ways what that point might mean. I mean, it could mean that there's something wrong with the world, and Adorno certainly thought there was a lot wrong with the world, so that maybe the world might be such that you really, you could only think you were at home in it mistakenly. That the world is not actually hospitable to us. So there'd be some sort of illusion in thinking you were at home in it. So that could be one thing. Or he just doesn't like the notion of being at home in the world that I'm presenting as a good thing. But you might say that, like, no, that the right way to be is to be in resistance, perhaps, or to fight, to seek maladjustment or something like that. So I don't know if Zach can help me out with this. Maybe there isn't a chance for him to come back, but I'd be glad to have Adorno be explained on this.
I'll have a look and see if he comes up with something in a minute. But I mean, it's interesting again. So the Morrison story, I think, perhaps brings out some of the tension of this, right? Because it's a young girl, and she's naive. She feels at home in the world. She encounters the racism, and she suddenly isn't. It's like her innocence is taken away. She doesn't feel at home in the world in that same way. So maybe being at home with the world isn't that kind of childhood innocence. Is there a way of being, and is there a way of being at home in the world in which we are, as Adorno would like us to be, fully aware of the problems and tensions? And in fact, isn't that one of the things that fiction and literature and the arts can do? It can alert us to what's wrong as well as what's right. In a way, though, that still helps us to sort of feel genuinely here. You see what I mean?
Yeah, so that's nice. And let me see if I can connect this clearly to the way Morrison handles that, because that the child who Pekala is her name, who sees the dandelions on the sidewalk crack and then later sort of disavows them. She suffers sort of irreparable harm from kind of aesthetic expectations that she can't meet. I won't explain how that works. The narrator, the one who gives the other passage talking about what she wants for Christmas is an experience, she's allowed to be older and wiser. So she's narrating about her own childhood and Pekala's childhood, and exposing the thing that Pekala can't understand. And so the reader then gets the benefit of the older Claudia's understanding, and it's a very dark understanding. It's she's sort of just making it really clear how people's potential for what I would call a good aesthetic life has been demolished or corrupted. And so then you sort of go through this like just layering of perspectives on what's going on. And the novel as a whole, I think, even though you get Claudia's very, very dark vision, you still get Claudia thinking about what's been going on. And that is a kind of positive, that is a really valuable achievement. And it's one that you might think that is what the novel can do. It can make you kind of see the unfolding of a really devastating aesthetic and ethical kind of set of circumstances, and yet achieve reflective clarity about it. And so that achievement that the literary work can I think carry out might be the is it a maladjustment? It's a good maladjustment, possibly. I don't know. Like being resistant to a certain thing is at work in your society, so you're not attuned to it, but you're importantly critiquing it. Yeah.
Okay, we've got another question here. I'm not sure I understand the second part of it, but we'll see. And apologies for mispronouncing names. I'm saying Rashid Andalusi. And there's always a bit of clarification, really, because the question is aesthetics in art or in life. Because it seems to me that in the talk you've been talking sometimes about art, sometimes in life. And I think it'd be quite interesting just to sort of stand back and get your take here on when we talk about our aesthetic orientation to the world, how, the specific aesthetic, artistic life bits and aesthetic orientation in general. I'm not sure about the question, after all, we can't occupy two spaces at the same time. If you've got anything to say about that, please do it. If not, just address the first part. Yeah.
Well, I would thank the questioner for pointing out a sort of issue behind what I was doing here, because I did try to emphasize what you might just call the aesthetic in life. This is this pervasive responsiveness to experience, to conditions, that doesn't have to have anything to do with art. But then there are sort of crystallizations of aesthetic priorities and possibilities that are in art. really intensely. And that's, I think, I like the Yuriko Saito article because her piece is kind of about both. Like, she is talking about things that probably amount to artistic practices of ceramics and this kind of very delicate design and repair and so forth, that you might say this becomes an art, but it's sort of continuous with just making teacups just so that you'll have a vessel to drink from. So she's doing that. She's also talking about the ceremonies in which these vessels would have been used, which again, in her account, I think sort of mix the artistic and what you might just call the living of aesthetic choices. Now, I don't think, like, I think you certainly could just think about the cultural locatedness and the personal without bringing a huge amount of art into play, or without bringing art appreciation into the picture. But in terms of what you might call understanding aesthetic value, it is useful, I think, often to think about how we identify the features of artworks that have aesthetic value. That is one of the contexts in which people talk really carefully about aesthetic value. So that's one reason you might sort of put these domains together in this kind of talk. But to your second thought, that we can't be in two spaces at once, I suppose I disagree with that, but I'd have to think harder about what I'm claiming there. But like, very roughly, when we engage with art, we are the real people we are, and we somehow, these art objects are in our lives, and I think that's sort of the basic important thing about them. I guess what you're suggesting that I'm not acknowledging very much is the sense in which the artwork can change our aesthetic context kind of radically. It can give you entry to a space of experience that, in some sense, just feels like it came out of nowhere. You're washing the dishes, and then you turn on the radio, and there's some incredible music that has nothing to do with your life, and you might feel completely absorbed in it and carried away from the dishwashing. That's an incredible power of art, and you might say, I'm in a different space, and I am going to be responsive to very different values and stimuli in that space. I somehow would want to grant that and yet say you're in your life too. I'm not sure I'm dealing with it well, but that would be my attempt.
Very, very interesting indeed. Now, I'd like to perhaps turn to a few of the questions, the points you raised at the end, and I can tie that in with a question we got from the audience. You said that you're not seeking a harmonized conception of aesthetic engagement and evaluation. I think you said something like, that's just doesn't seem interesting to you or worthwhile. Perhaps I'd like you to say a little bit more about that before we just set that aside. And that does relate, because John Kaleja, or Kaleja, as I pronounced it, put up a question here, which was that, does, for example, Kant's harmonious integration of memory and imagination lead to a global theory of aesthetics? So you did talk about, Kant's view of the free play of the imagination and so forth. And that does sound like some kind of universal understanding of how art works, which has some kind of merit. So why are you saying you're not interested in creating a harmonized global conception of aesthetic engagement and evaluation?
Yeah, so, and thank you for the question. I have found Kant to be a very powerful theory builder in this area. It's a really attractive theory. It's just so yeah, he thinks there is a distinctive aesthetic mode that generates a distinctive pleasure, this disinterested pleasure, in which you're not settling on what you want out of this experience or what the experience is for. You're not able to attach a concept to it that will explain what it is and therefore what can be done with it or what's to be believed on that basis. You're just not able to. This is the free play. It's a free play, rather. But it is a free play of our imagination and understanding. That is, these cognitive faculties we have. And that's the thing is, when you look at other traditions, I think what you find is that it may not be a free play. And this pleasure, it's just not always appropriate to call it a disinterested pleasure, I think. So, well, it's very tricky territory. So I don't want to try to explain the depth of the issues here. But if you take Claudia's account of her experience that she would like for Christmas, I'm presenting that as a kind of aesthetic ideal in her hands, like that she is trying to pack into an imagined experience exactly what she wants. And I don't think there's any way you could call this a disinterested pleasure. She's just more trying to explore the possibilities of meaningful pleasure for her. And I want to say that's a great aesthetic project. And I don't want to have to step back in a Kantian way and say, well, but it's like really personal to you, Claudia, and you're not engaged in a free play. You're actually like using your desires to be close to people and to have a certain kind of fullness of experience that's too particular to you. And I just can't disqualify what she's talking this. Well, it's a fictional character, but I can't disqualify it by saying, it's not. It's too anchored in your needs and desires. So that's maybe. Okay, so let me say one other actually universalizing thing that sort of comes out of Kant that I probably do believe about the aesthetic, which is, it's not that it's disinterested pleasure, it's not that it's a totally free play, but it is an experimental. It has some kind of openness to questioning what we think is good built into it. That's sort of how I think of the importance of the aesthetic, that it's a place where we experience things rather carefully, intensely, and we don't have to be already knowledgeable about what the good of all of this is. So you might call that a kind of freedom, but it's more an openness to changing our minds about what we want and experience, or what could be good there. What kinds of categories might be useful to us. So I probably would always look for that in the aesthetic, but I don't want to rule out certain kinds of interests, certain kinds of function. I just don't see a reason to go full Kantian on the aesthetic. And part of that comes out of just seeing different traditions where this is something I've been teaching or we've been thinking about in my classes this week, where the functionality of things and the aesthetic satisfactions of them just really come together. And that's a rather un-Kantian way to think about aesthetic experience.
Yeah, it's very interesting indeed. I mean, I must admit, when I was doing aesthetics as an undergraduate, I very much enjoyed it. I very liked it, but I ended up getting very frustrated with this idea that we should be trying to say what is art or what is beauty. It seemed to me that these things contain multitudes, and it was very interesting to explore those multitudes. But playing this game of can we nail them down into one universal totalizing theory seemed to me obviously hopeless, and I was surprised people continued with it. Now, we've got a question here from Andrew Lambert, which is there's a background to this actually. So the background to this is in another comment. He points out that certain classical Confucian thinkers approve of socialization as a means to generate shared aesthetic responses, with a view to generating consensus and social harmony. So this is a real view that. A lot of the purpose of art is to cultivate that shared social space, and that's really important for bringing people together. And it is quite interesting, actually, how in many, if you think of many times of coming together, national times of coming together, they can be around, particularly around sort of a music or performance or something. So that's the kind of the background. But then the question we've got here, which should pop up now, is can you say more then about your assumption that the personal path has weight? Because there's a sense in which all individuated aesthetic experience is personal in some sense, right? I mean, you don't just mean in the trivial sense that we all have we all react to things aesthetically as individuals. You're presumably saying more than that. So why do you think the personal path has weight? What do you mean by that, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I suppose one basic thing I could say is that I don't think we wait for socialization to have aesthetic orientation or disorientation. We're able to sort of diverge or go our own way. And it's kind of, I suppose, I think of that as a precious thing about us. So even if I have soaked up an enormous amount of aesthetic expectations, patterns, just tendencies I don't even know I have about what's appealing or not. I am able to sort of overcome that, or as I say, just diverge from that individually, as needed, perhaps. That is, I don't think we're all alike in what we need aesthetically. I think that, and it has to do with all sorts of things going on in one's life. When you have suffered great loss, I think then you're just not going to be able to accept perhaps the happy vision or the positive aesthetic qualities of things in the same way. And so that sort of specifics of your life path are going to, I think, they have power to affect, give you a way to reject or abstain from certain kinds of aesthetic socialization. But I also think we just, we don't always live our live aesthetically with full power. So I don't always pay attention in the right way to my aesthetic life, and I sort of can be on a sort of cultural autopilot, like thinking I get what I'm experiencing and what it amounts to and what I'm really appreciative of. And that's just not, it's not fine-grained enough, in fact. Like I can, if I sort of really zero in on it, I can realize, no, I don't think I'm fully, I don't subscribe to this aesthetic taste that in some sense I've been using or acting as if this is my taste, but I can come to realize it's not adequate for me. So I think I'm just sort of trying to describe what I mean by it, but how to prove that it really does have weight. I suppose it's just because your socialization will never cover everything that needs to be covered in your life path in aesthetic terms. Like we are each unique in what we're going to encounter. The way the cushions in my office chair react to me and the way I'm shaped and so forth. That's my aesthetic life, minimal as it is. And there's a sense in which I have to, at some point in my life, I hope I acknowledge that individual, stamp of experience on me. Feel like I really haven't given a clear answer to that, but I don't want to dismiss at all the thing that was in the setup for your question, this idea that collective aesthetic influences can be really important to creating community. The songs that we all know, there are very few songs that we all know, but if you are in a community where you can sing together, for instance, that's a kind of wonderful, participation in something bigger than the self, that can be, a really heartening part of a life.
Yeah. Andrew knows a lot more about Wuism or Confucianism than I do, so feel free to shoot me down if I get this wrong. But it seems to me that what you said, Eileen, is kind of compatible with that broad Confucian view, as you've said in your final comments there, because the traditional Confucian view is not that harmony requires absolute uniformity. There has to be space for diversity. Harmony is not uniformity. It actually requires some difference. So maybe there are, these two things are not necessarily in tension, and that and both the extremes would be intolerable, the kind of absolute social conformity, but also the kind of anarchy of each to their own. I just want to sorry, briefly just to come back with Zach did have a little bit of clarification on what he meant. We can perhaps put this up, and he was thinking about that famous line, "No poetry could be written after Auschwitz. Maybe we shouldn't feel at home in the world." But does that accord with your feeling that we ought to encounter more than we feel at home with? Does that make? Maybe that's just a yes or a no or something. But does that clarify anything from? I'm sorry to bring you back and forth. It's very difficult mentally to go like this.
Oh no, it's good exercise for me. So that is one thought. I don't think I spelled this out very well. The idea that the world might be such that the right thing to do is to not be comfortable in it, to not be adjusted to it well. I suppose there's lots of debate about exactly what Adorno hoped for or meant by that comment. I'm on the side of give me more poetry, because the poetry can do the hard thing of at least partly not be consoling, but be trying to make us face the thing that has, turned the world into a nightmare. I mean, I think it really can do that, but it's true, it will give you some sort of artistic form that is a positive achievement. It is a positive step to find the words for it. And I guess in a certain mood or at a certain point, Adorno thought that would not be worth doing. But I guess I think it is worth doing. It's like an amazing achievement if you can do that after Auschwitz, and that somehow has to be honored. Yeah.
We're coming towards the end of the time. There's a couple more points, perhaps. One of the last things you mentioned was one benefit we've got here is to acknowledge and reflect on global movements in aesthetic traditions. Now, one of those is a not positive one. And we had a few comments earlier, it's interesting how text can convey a certain sort of agitation. People don't necessarily put their names in these things, and what they're supposed to put is Abhimanyu Sanatana Dharma. Abhimanyu is a legendary warrior from the Mahabharata, and Sanatana Dharma is some people's preferred name for what is often called Hinduism. And various comments which are really kind of, in fact, they seem to be almost sort of like pinning sort of British imperialism on you. I'm not quite sure why. But I just wondered, is there anything you would say about that aspect of the move? Do we think enough about that? Do we think in the right ways about the ways in which certain globalized forces have led to oppression, obliteration, the quietening of, the ignoring of, etc., etc., certain traditions and aesthetic ways of thinking and cultural life?
I don't think we've thought at all enough about it. I mean, there are scholars, there are activists who write about this. Edward Said got many discussions off the ground. I think it's like you have to you have to rethink a huge number of your assumptions to figure out how off-kilter an education like mine has been. I've had a very European-centric education, and then suppose you've had that education, and then you start to realize, this is, it's just left me with a lot of kind of go-to examples of art works and art traditions that in no way reflect the scope of what the world holds, and yet and that they often those traditions disguise the suppression of other traditions, or the kind of the layering of meaning and the presentation of other traditions as somehow, I don't even want to use the words, I mean, just as somehow lesser than, or so it's just like there's this huge educational project that's very hard to carry out once you're like living your life in a certain culturally located way. But so, in fact, people are trying to write about this. It has to be done just with lots of care and knowledge. You have to get more knowledge than most of us have. I've taught a paper by someone whose heritage is Indian, and she's written really interestingly about early 20th century, 19th and 20th century Indian artists trying to be Indian artists, and how hard that was in the colonial, or that it was like a trap. Like you could be Indian, but it would then carry some baggage you didn't want it to have. And, so I think work like that just needs to be done, like exploring how artists form identities, what the conditions are that make it hard to form those identities in a way that they're happy with. But it's not like there are going to be like beautiful solutions to a bad history. You just have to kind of think about it carefully and try to change your priorities and what looks obvious to someone with my kind of education is not obvious, and I have to kind of keep finding that out.
Okay, the last quick one, perhaps, no, I say quick one, it's actually a big question, but I mean, perhaps we just have a short answer on this. One of the points you made was we should demote this concern for what's best. That this is a kind of a fool's errand. You've got your two-tone mug from Coventry, Ska or Baroque. Let's not argue what's sort of best. But I mean, I suppose a lot of people, the resistance they have to that is, well, surely there's got to be room for judgments of good and bad, better and best, right? I mean, if not, if you're not going to try which is the best, the whatever, is there still a room, do you think, in aesthetic judgment for judgments of good and bad, better and worse? Or should you just forget all about that? And
yeah, better and worse is much better. Better and worse are much better, and we're better at them, and they're more relevant to the choices we have to make. So yeah, when I say defer or demote, yeah, in a way that's sort of a just wrong-headed claim on my part, in the sense that I would be saying we're actually making some sort of implicit aesthetic better and worse judgments all the time. When I put these socks on in the morning rather than those, and there's something aesthetically going on there, I'm probably making those are better judgment. And you just have to do that. Okay. But I'm probably not making a deep aesthetic value judgment. I'm making a really complex, situated, better than this aesthetic judgment. So I think that's quite important. We have to do that. I just think we've been crazily worried about the best, the masterpieces. I actually considered having a slide in this talk about the use of the term masterpiece in the aesthetic debates that I read about. I just think that's been really hindering. We would get, this is more the Humean aesthetic tradition, we would get the ideal critics who would be able to make the judgment of which works are best. Although actually maybe Hume isn't so set on that. But still, I just think at this point in time, when we're trying to expand our horizons, settling on the value judgment should seem like a hugely difficult task, hugely fraught. So at least defer it. But of course, keep on making your necessary better and worse discriminations, because we will do that. Okay, so I have to sharpen that thought up better.
Okay, well, look, thanks very much. We've run out of time for this evening and for the first half of our season. This talk and all the others in the series and an archive going back years and other events is on our YouTube channel. Please do explore them. Join our mailing list. Follow us on Twitter to see what's coming up from February, where we have another really fascinating set of lectures on this theme of expanding horizons. Eileen, it's been a really interesting talk. You've made me certainly want to go and read The Bluer Sky by Toni Morrison. I shall be heading out to get that. I will not be ordering it from Amazon, but I shall be going down to my local bookshop, which is familiar and therefore loved. Thank you all for watching, but thanks overall, most of all, to Eileen John for a really good talk and a really rich discussion.
Thank you.